the the way most stories start, if you're from the north, it says, once upon a time. The way it starts in the south, it says, y'all ain't going to believe this. We're going to get both of those today. A little bit of a parable. And it's not original with me. I should give credit. I first heard it from Morris Venden, and he heard it from a man named H.M.S. Richards Sr., parts of it. And H.M.S. Richards Sr. and Morris Venden had heard some from a man named William Fagel. Some of us folks who are almost on Social Security will know all those names. Some of you are like, really? Who are those? Do I have to learn them for a history test? So you can just add my name to the list because I've modified it a little bit. In the little village of Bethany, about 3 miles from Jerusalem, lived two sisters, Mary and Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Lazarus was the breadwinner of the family. Father and mother were gone. So Mary, Martha, Lazarus lived in the little village, enjoyed a happy life there. Lazarus would go to work every day. He'd pack his lunch, a little pita bread, a few figs, a little serving of tofu. And then he'd come home, read the evening news, and go to bed, get up, repeat that the next day. Martha was the Martha type. She could run a potluck. She could run wedding dinners and church picnics. That was her thing. That was her place. She was never happier than when she was in the kitchen trying out a new recipe and sharing it with others. Martha was a good person, never did anything wrong. Probably her worst offense was chewing her nails too close, especially if the Vitamix broke down in the middle of a recipe. She was religious also, very religious. It was hard not to be religious in those days. Every Sabbath morning, she took the path to the synagogue. Her sister Mary was uniquely different. She was more interested in the social scene. She loved people. She loved church socials and church picnics, but she was not serving the food. She was the greeter and the hugger, and she always felt at home, making other people feel welcome and at home. Martha was attractive in a good, ordinary way. Mary was attractive, maybe even stunning in certain qualities. But Mary had recently been carrying a secret load of guilt, a misery that no one suspected. It had to do with her uncle Simon the Pharisee. Pharisees got good marks in those days. It was not so much like today, but in those days, yes, if you said, what's your son going to do? He's going to go into the Pharisee branch of government. Everyone would smile and nod their heads. That's nice. Simon got very good marks in Bethany. He was a church leader. He was respected in the community. He was respected for his close association with his family of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. As close kin, he was expected to look after his relatives. One day, he looked too long at Mary. In his position, his influence soon led Mary to give in to his demands. Apparently, no one knew what was going on. At least they weren't talking about it. Simon continued to lead at the synagogue. Mary smiled and chatted and was charming, but the guilt was almost overwhelming. A few times, she tried to reason with Uncle Simon and break away from the control of the situation, but women were not listened to, especially in those days. There was threats, there were words, but again, even with the blame coming mostly on her, she continued to persevere and to hang on. But she was losing hope. And as so often happens with us when we tend to lose hope and we see no way out of a troublesome and bad situation, especially if we think it's a secret sin of our own, we begin to punish ourselves. She was reminded, as everyone was, that there was a payment necessary for sin. There were lambs and sacrifices involved. Things died. And she was paying for her own sin by punishing herself. But she kept committing the same sin again and again. And so she felt worse and worse. The self-punishment continued, as it often does to us, and it can lead to disastrous consequences. So was Mary as she fell into the cycle of self-punishment. She came to be known around town as that loose woman. Mothers were heard whispering, "Have you heard about Mary? Watch your children, especially your young men." Things got so bad that Mary decided to leave town. She packed her belongings and left the city on the hills and came to a village by the sea, Magdala. She became known as Mary from Magdala. She arrived in Magdala determined that she was going to start a new life, and so she began to look for work. She went first to a catering business because she knew all about that from her sister. No one was able to help her. She tried McDonald's, no help. Even went and applied for being a greeter at Walmart, but even Walmart was not hiring that day. The days of looking and rejection and hunger began to gnaw at her. And so she said, "Well, I might as well go back to something else I know. Why not? I'm already into it. The sacrifices, the lambs are still available, and I can get some measure of relief by the sacrifice." Mary did find those, a great many, who were willing to pay her price. And she found a degree and a place of acceptance. But the load of guilt was building and becoming heavier. She always thought of the happier days back in Bethany with her parents, with Martha, with Lazarus, before Simon, the days of peace and joy. One day, as she was reminiscing in those thoughts, a traveling preacher came near to Magdala. He didn't go to the synagogue to talk because there was not enough room. The crowds were tremendous. He talked to all the people openly, and he said the most amazing things. Like, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. I will give you rest." Other things like, "Whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast out." And then one that really got to her, "I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Mary lingered at the edge of the crowd, listening, contemplating. This was nothing she had ever heard before. Her heart began to grow warm and began to heal over as the crowds left, and she stayed. She poured out her needs to this young rabbi, and he knelt and prayed to his Father in a way that she'd never heard before, and gave her the help she needed, and she accepted the Father as never before. This new master, the devil was rebuked and left her. Mary was converted right there on the spot. It would be a beautiful and more wonderful story in some ways if it could end there. It would be so nice if she lived happily ever after. The preacher left town, but Mary didn't. Maybe she should have moved. But the same people, the same friends, the same voices began calling to her again. She had accepted the preacher, his peace, but the downward pull was so strong. Mary fell. And now we see how Jesus treated the fallen. Was he going to give rocks, or was he going to give restoration? Jesus came to town again. The crowds came, the people listened, Mary came, and she wondered as she came again if it's still true. Whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. It's still true, she said. She went to him again, and he was still accepting. The needs, the tears were shared and shed, and the prayers were given and the forgiveness made. And again, the preacher left town, but Mary didn't. Oh, that the story could have ended just like that, but Mary fell again and again and again. And Jesus came to town, and Mary was once again drawn to him. Whoever comes to me, he said again, I will in no wise cast out. Not long after this, an invitation came from Jerusalem. Perhaps it was a messenger who offered a large sum of money. Maybe it was lies that she was needed back near home. Maybe the uncle had made some inappropriate call. Whatever it was, Mary found herself back near home, not far away in Jerusalem, but she was being set up and she was being framed. The public exposure she had always feared was now about to become a reality. The door where she was at that moment knocked open, the apartment somewhere near, maybe even on the sanctuary campus, burst open, loud voices, angry hands taking her, dragging her to the street, and words were ringing through her ears and her head. Sinner, cover yourself. Mary closes her eyes, and she wished that she could die. She was dragged through the streets, and she was thrown down at the feet of the one that she least wanted to see in this circumstance. Accusations and debate were heard on the fringes and throughout the crowd as the dust settled and as she waited. There were some who were beginning to wonder what really was going on here. As she lay there, not looking, not daring to see what was about to happen, thinking even Jesus couldn't help her now. She waited in fear and shame, but it got quieter. The sounds of the mob were just a little less, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw a stone that someone had in their hand slip from their fingers and kick up dust as it hit the ground. And she glanced a little more, and she noticed Jesus was writing. What was that he was writing? Because the crowd was totally focused on it. Maybe he was writing how illegal this particular circumstance was because the husband was supposed to bring the charges if there was a case like this. Or maybe he was writing down in Leviticus and Deuteronomy from the Old Testament that there should be equal punishment for the male as well as the female, and they were waiting for the other party, but it was a case of pure biased entrapment. Maybe they were watching all that Jesus was writing, or maybe he was writing something more personal. Maybe he was writing Mary's name, and then he was writing other people's names and putting one-word associations there in that dust with it. Whatever it was, all the stones began to hit the ground, and the crowd thinned out. And then once again, Jesus spoke to her, as he had so many times. Where are your accusers? Has no man condemned you? She raised her head. All the accusers were gone. Neither do I condemn you. Go, sin no more. Mary was again kneeling at the feet of Jesus. She again received forgiveness and new power, and she learned a lesson that day that she had missed before somehow, what all of us need to learn, that it is possible to find Jesus when you need him most. Even in your worst circumstances, Jesus will show up, but he's come to give you strength and courage and purpose again. She learned what we can learn, that we can stay at the feet of Jesus even if he's not in town. Have you discovered this? It's hard to sin when you're sitting at the feet of Jesus. Even though Jesus went on his way that day, Mary was ready to continue to be at his feet. She had a bright idea. Why not go home? It's not far. Yes, let's do that. Surely Jesus' power is for everyone, and it will be something that will sustain me if I go home and face all that I have to face there. She packed and immediately went to Bethany. When she was within sight of town, she heard voices, those lonely, mournful voices, those cries of despair. The lepers outside that village and often many villages of that day. The stroke, the finger of God, the judgment of God. Whether you were rich or poor, no rank prevented you from getting the leprosy. And you had to announce it, and you had to beg for mercy from the people as well as from God. But as Mary was passing along the road and headed closer into town, there was a note in one of the voices that sounded familiar. She pulled her scarf a little more across her face and glanced over, and her eyes got large, and she missed a step. I guess there's nothing to fear from Simon the Pharisee anymore, since he's over there making those cries. Good. Let him rot. Well, maybe. She rushed on to her house. It was a joyous reunion. Word got out, Mary's back. Watch out, Mary's back. She's changed. We've heard that before. That's how people talked in those days. It was difficult for Mary, but she stayed. She shared the great news about her friend and her Savior. She wanted others to know him and his love and his acceptance and his power. She wanted others to sit at his feet as she had done and be blessed by his visits. Jesus did come to visit, and he brought 12 of his companions. And the voice was heard as they were making one of their visits, "Unclean, unclean." The lepers were crying out. This young preacher seemed to have a special love for those in special need. And when he heard those folks cry out, he was going to go and help them, even if 9 of them would not return. And so he stopped and he heard and he healed them. He didn't ask for Bible studies. He didn't ask for long-term commitments. He just healed them. It's easy to think sometimes that Jesus heals only those who are about to be taken to heaven anyway. But that's definitely not the case with Simon. Jesus healed because of who Jesus is, not because of who Simon was, or because of who any of us are. What would Mary say? How would she feel? She would be reassured that Simon's power was broken. But what would she do now that he was healed? Healing a Pharisee, though, is a terrible thing to do. It puts an awful load. Because a Pharisee has to earn and deserve all of the rewards, even the rewards from God. And so Simon, who's been healed, is in agony. And he's pacing back and forth. What can he do? What can I do? I have to pay this healer, this rabbi, back. I know. I'll throw a feast. And so he makes arrangements and he makes the contacts. Who's the best caterer in town? Martha, of course. Let's get Martha over. Who will, Mary, No, she's not invited. Lazarus, excellent. Excellent. Martha and Lazarus at my feast. The night of the banquet, all seems to be going well, except Mary was sitting home alone. She would have enjoyed the party in spite of the murmurers. Mostly, she was suffering because she wasn't able to be with Jesus. She was worried a little because Jesus had recently been saying things in a more forceful, in a more systematic way. I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be betrayed, and I'm going to be put to death. And she was puzzled because most of the disciples didn't seem to tune in on that, but it was breaking her heart and causing her concern. And she thought about Jesus being so close by, and just in days it seemed he might go and suffer this fate. And she remembered a beautiful, expensive alabaster box of ointments, especially designed for burials. And she thought, because it was her nature, why not give it to him now so he can enjoy it? And she impulsively grabs the box and hurries through the streets and the shadows, and she enters the back door. The kitchen is there, the party is going on. Mary has one thing on her mind: to get to the feet of Jesus. Martha sees her, comes by, and she starts to question her, but it's too late. Mary moves through the dining room, holding to the edges. The light doesn't cast much. I'll get next to Jesus' feet. I'll present this gift to him, maybe even anoint his feet, and then I'll slip back home. One flaw that did not completely occur to her: this ointment was extremely potent and not very subtle. And pretty soon, every nose in the room was turned towards her. Simon, his eyes with daggers looking at her. Judas, counting the cost and the expense. All of this began to sink into her awareness, and she fumbles and spills, and she looks around. I forgot the towel, and so she drops her hair down. An old habit from a woman who served in that particular job. And she begins to wipe the feet of Jesus. Her only attention is Jesus. Simon, on the other hand, is thinking, if he really knew, if he was a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. Mary hears Jesus' friendly, commanding voice. Let her alone. She has done a good thing. Wherever the gospel is preached, this story will be told. Then Jesus changes his tone of voice and his focus, and he looks up to the head table and he says, Simon. Simon's heart begins to race and he breaks out in a cold sweat. Simon, I have something to say to you. Will the mask be pulled away? Would this mind reader reveal his deep, dark secrets? Jesus goes on to tell a story about two debtors, one with a large debt, one with a small debt. Both are freely forgiven. No one in the room knows the backstory except for Simon and Mary. Simon got the message. He really got it. Simon became overwhelmed by the love and the compassion of this young man, who now he was more convinced than ever surely was from God, who could have exposed every dark sin of his life. Instead, Jesus veiled the truth in a parable and gave Simon some protection and some opportunity. And Simon's heart was broken. He could never repay him. At his own feast, Simon accepted Jesus. as Master and Savior. Jesus got Simon too. Mary and Simon, Jerry Mobley, we all have things that have gone on in our lives. What we need most is to sit at the feet of Jesus for our acceptance and restoration and new purpose. The stones that some want to use against us, Jesus says, I have set those aside, and I have taken those stones and used them to help you build a new and better foundation and a new life. In fact, he says there's a prophecy that says there's a stone rejected, but I have become the cornerstone in your life and purpose. He accepts, he restores, he loves us. There is room for all at the feet of Jesus. Let's sing a song to close together, can we?